Why did George Orwell shoot an elephant? By Justen Everage. In Shooting an Elephant, George Orwell describes an incident where he was called to respond to an elephant that had become aggressive and was ravaging a town. It had destroyed a garbage truck, killed a cow, chased locals, and otherwise wreaked elephantly havoc before Orwell got the call. Eventually, death would strike more than the cow. The essay in review was written of Orwell's days in Burma while he was begrudgingly working for the British Indian Imperial Police as a superintendent. In other words, he was an enforcer for the British Empire's policing in India at the time. Orwell was born in India, but was a white British man who lived in the time of British imperialism. This was a time period from the 17th to the mid-20th century where the British Empire conquered foreign nations politically and economically by introducing and leveraging Western trade practices and tariffs. Among these nations were India and neighboring Burma. Orwell was impressively ahead of his time and criticized imperialism as a means of taking advantage of nations for profit and political gain. Even gentle-natured elephants are prone to periods of aggression as their hormones take to seasonal changes. This testosterone-flooded state is called must, or as Orwell wrote it, must. Elephants were commonly used in Burmese labor in this time period and are still to this day employed to drag downward logs for the logging industry. While this elephant's owner anticipated its impending period of must, he failed to adequately secure the elephant by chain, unknowingly committing Orwell to a haunting experience. When called, Orwell decided to bring his .44 Winchester rifle to the scene, a weapon he knew wasn't powerful enough to euthanize the animal, in hopes of simply firing a warning shot loud enough to scare it away, should the need arise, before its owner could arrive to recover and confine it by chain. By the time Orwell located the elephant, he'd come across a growing crowd of concerned locals who pointed out to him a mangled adult male victim of the animal. Orwell described the corpse's state in harrowing detail. He senses his initial plan to scare the elephant away wouldn't satisfy the crowd, who'd just watched their market be destroyed and had then lost a community member to the multi-ton mammal. Orwell calls for someone to retrieve his larger rifle, one he thought capable of putting the elephant to rest. Orwell described the amassing crowd as imposing, expectant, almost voyeuristic, just as he'd expect a British crowd to be, he wrote. As a people, the locals didn't welcome his presence, but in this instance they looked for him to do what was expected of a self-proclaimed keeper of peace. Previously, he'd acknowledged his private philosophical sympathies for the local Burmese people and their reluctance to being occupied by British imperialist forces. As a working cog in the imperialist machine, however, he had also been frustrated by threats and insults he'd personally received from them in his position as assistant superintendent. In the end, Orwell decided to shoot the elephant, probably in part because he felt obligated to feed the justice-seeking and bloodthirsty crowd who was near boiling over with anticipation, and in part by his own admission to avoid looking foolish. Feed here is to be read literally as well as not, by the way. Orwell wrote that the crowd picked the elephant to the bones that evening. As Orwell figured it, a white British imperialist authority who came to the rescue of impoverished locals, rifle in hand, and then turned back, leaving the elephant be, would have proven his presence unproductive. This was despite the elephant having settled down for the moment. The shooting didn't go smoothly, as the elephant's biology was more resistant to Orwell's rifle than he expected. In the elephant's agonizing final hour, Orwell wondered if the crowd realized he performed what he seems to have considered an unnecessary killing to prevent himself from looking a fool, something he said every white man's goal was who was occupying the area. It's widely accepted that Orwell's 1936 recounting of shooting an elephant is a means for him to criticize British imperialism. Orwell describes the profound realization he had while facing the elephant, with the unarmed Burmese people behind him awaiting action. This is highlighted when he wrote, "When the white man turns tyrant, it is his own freedom that he destroys." Orwell used the term white man in Shooting an Elephant to describe a white Western political force, namely the imperialist rulers who saw lesser developed nations as troves of ignorantly supervised resources and who, from their gold-accented thrones, drooled over them like hungered Looney Tunes characters imagining their friend as a Christmas ham. It was not common to write of imperialism as a force of evil in Orwell's time. Many of his contemporaries were sympathetic to Britain's invasive impulses, since they did offer modern industries like schools, roads, manufactured goods, etc. to the nations that they economically infiltrated. It was thought by many a fair price to pay for joining the civilized world. This did not take into account the actual burden a country would realize when gifted such infiltration, including scavenging of resources, taxation without representation, exploitation of workforces, and even abuse of local women. His immediate situation was mirrored in the larger scenario that brought him to it in the first place, a Western empire tyrannically imposing themselves on a foreign people, unprepared for the obligation it would cause. Orwell accepted a role in this system when he became an assistant superintendent for the Indian Imperial Police. Because of this, he soon found himself compromised, having to perform the torturous killing of an animal he described as having a grandmotherly air to fulfill the expectations of locals. This foreshadowed the compromise British imperialism brought upon its own kingdom, including events that led to its eventual retreat from India as the nation fell apart into civil war in 1947. Orwell is clearly aware of the injustices of imperialism, yet he plays a role in its enforcement. He paradoxically agrees and sympathizes with the locals that hate his placement in Burma, while holding them in disdain for their treatment of him. Orwell starts his essay by claiming that his role in the police force was the only career he'd had that ever made him feel important enough to be hated. He later describes well the contempt he had for his job, but I don't think the important comment was entirely tongue-in-cheek. He clearly felt a duty to his position, to the people that he was overseeing, and to the empire that employed him. I suspect he could see the imperialist movement for what it was seen to be today, an era in history where some innate authoritarian, greedy human flaw found yet another form in which to manifest politically. George Orwell is known for writing in duality, and Shooting an Elephant is rife with it. He draws parallels in his comparison of the dreadful task and how the crowd's expectation oppressed him as the empire oppressed the crowd through him. He claims he feels for the Burmese, yet simultaneously hates them in some way. He's concerned with the community's minor financial loss and struggles with the morality of shooting an animal, all while describing the human corpse he discovered as devilish. In the final paragraph of Shooting an Elephant, he wrote that he was glad the man died, for it justified his killing of the elephant. Orwell wrote of several of the events and characters in Shooting an Elephant in a strikingly objective, distant manner. I was a little surprised when the elephant's owner was mentioned again later in the piece. He dodged any hint of blame by Orwell's pen. The owner was mentioned in regard to the loss of the financial value of the elephant. I suspect Orwell made this decision so as not to distract from the story's underlying directing blame to the British Empire. I don't think it's possible to say exactly where Orwell's moral compass centers based solely on this essay. His dismissive attitude regarding the loss of life could have been for frustration, lack of time to further detail, or to highlight his objectivity as a narrator. the latter of which to the reader could possibly give him a level of importance or respect only known to him since his days as a superintendent or assistant superintendent. The Burmese people and their imposing, if imagined, chanting and laughter took the brunt of the blame for Orwell's decision in his essay. He could not disappoint their expectation and prove himself a fool, a waste of existence who would not do what he was called upon to do. Orwell never wrote or spoke publicly of his described experience shooting an elephant to be fiction, but many scholars, most notably Bernard Crick, have figured it was fabricated to convey the desired meaning. Some evidence has been offered in each direction, but I don't personally care to speculate because it's the meaning of the story that matters to me. The meaning of this story should matter to hundreds or thousands of people who are in Orwell's position today as well. This includes the police and guards at the U.S. Capitol who may have felt the same pressure to uphold a governmental duty despite their potential personal feelings on the election. Also, the police officers tasked with holding back crowds at the Black Lives Matter riots, where some of them, if not outwardly, privately celebrating as burning liquor bottles and ready-stacked bricks lacerated the windows of the institutions they knew from the inside to be corrupt in many ways. I'm not taking a stance here. I just see the mirroring between Orwell's confliction and the confliction that those employees might also face. Orwell's often self-contradictory duality that makes his writings so relatable. There's something we all hate to acknowledge, uncertainty in our beliefs and decisions, and Orwell highlights that as good as any author I've read. If we can't accept the irony and moral inconsistency within ourselves, how can we accept it of others? This seems a necessary step in having any productive dialogue with those in opposing political camps. There's so much to learn from Orwell's writings, and with this early essay, Shooting an Elephant, it's just as relevant today as it were when it was written.